Hello, my name is Andre Ward, and I'm the Associate Vice President for the David Rothenberg Center for Public Policy at the Fortune Society. Welcome to Both Sides of the Bars, a discussion driven show that examines the legal system from various perspectives, including people most impacted by the criminal legal system. We discuss critical questions about how the current system works, its intersections with social justice, and we highlight the efforts that are being made to improve the lives of everyone affected. We ask you, the listener and the viewer, to join Fortune Society and to spread the word about both sides of the bars. You can also share your comments on Twitter at the Fortune SOC. Today's show is really, really important as we begin to look at and examine how people's lives are impacted once they're released from prison or from jails. So we have today some really important guests that's going to be talking about something that's really important as it relates to journeys coming home from prison. This show is entitled Free, and it's based on a new book that's been put out, 2 Years, 6 Lies, and The Long Journey Home. It's an award by an award-winning author and journalist, Lauren Kessler, who sets out to answer the questions about what happens to the 95% of Americans who eventually are released from prison. The book follows 6 formerly incarcerated individuals whose stories paint a portrait of the institutionalized roadblocks, societal stigmas, and often overwhelming psychological challenges that come with reentering their communities. This episode's guests are Lauren Kessler, as well as one of the individuals in the book, Sterling Cunio, a PEN America Writing for Justice Fellow who was sentenced to life without parole at the age of 16 and then spent 27 years in prison before a sentence was commuted by the governor of Oregon. Lauren and Sterling, welcome to Both Sides of the Bars. How are each of you doing today?
Thanks so much for having us.
Absolutely. And for our viewers, I just want to get into a little biographical information about both Lauren and Sterling. So Lauren is a narrative nonfiction writer who specializes in exploring invisible subcultures in our midst. The author of 15 books, she's written about the gritty world of maximum security prisons, the grueling world of ballot, and the surprisingly vibrant world of those with Alzheimer's. She ran a writing group for lifers inside a maximum security penitentiary and has volunteered as a mentor at a prison reentry services nonprofit. And Sterling, he's a PEN American Writing for Justice Fellow, an Oregon Literary Arts Fellow, and a 2-time PEN Prison Writing Award winner, with sentences to life without parole at 16 and spent 27 years in prison. And so he currently works as the program coordinator for the Transformative Justice Initiative at Willamette University, where he focuses on creating a paradigm shift in the Oregon criminal legal system. Again, thank you so much, each of you, for joining us here at Both Sides of the Bars. I want to kind of get right into it because this book is really significant, Laura, and certainly the work that you've been doing, Sterling, is equally significant. But I'll start with the question, what are the toughest obstacles facing those released from incarceration? Not the most obvious ones, but the toughest ones from each of your vantage points. And I'll start, obviously, with you, Sterling, then we'll get to you, Lauren.
Well, thank you for having me and Lauren in this conversation. And I mean, first, I would say that prisoners ain't a homogenous group. So everybody's going to have very different challenges depending on the context, depending on the community that they come home to and the situation that they come home to. Whereas the obvious ones like housing is a huge one and employment is a huge one. But some of the not so obvious ones or so frequently discussed ones is just the trials and tribulations of reintegrating into a world that you don't know. Particularly, my peers, I come from a generation of juvenile lifers. So we spent more time inside of a world without tech or, healthy dynamics, and then come out into a world to where we have to learn everything quickly. And so some of them challenges, one of the big challenges that ain't frequently talked about is the trauma impacts of prison. It's we know how violent it is. We know how much deprivation there is, insensitivity, and then hypervigilance inside of an environment where violence is a constant. that's adaptive. But in the Cheesecake Factory, it becomes paranoia. And these reintegration and some of the psychological aspects of it, being a fully grown adult that doesn't know anything. And these are some of the challenges that are not as well documented but ever present.
And speaking of well documented, obviously, like Lauren, right? You had like set out on a course to create opportunities for people to develop their skills in learning while incarcerated, and also have documented the impact incarceration and reintegration has on individuals. Talk a little about that in terms of the questions, in terms of the toughest obstacles that are often faced from your vantage point by people coming home from prison.
Yeah, I really want to emphasize what Sterling said. I think when we talk about reentry, any to the extent that anybody talks about reentry, we often focus on housing and employment, and those are incredibly important. I'm not saying that they're not, but what Sterling was getting after, which is just the kind of person that you really have to become, especially in long-term incarceration, the protection that you create around yourself, the affect you have, the relationship that you have with others, that is special to that environment. And as Sterling well knows, that environment is quite toxic. So that it's called prisonization, and it creates a kind of personality. And that personality, those traits, those behaviors don't work in the free world. So I think that that change from being the kind of person who really can't make important decisions and doesn't make important decisions inside and must make thousands of decisions outside, and the kind of person who has learned not to trust, but then does need to open up and be vulnerable in the free world. That I think is the hardest kind of transition, the internal, psychological, emotional transition. And that's the one that very, very few people get help with. Housing, you can in some places get help with. Employment, in some places you can get help with. But that internal, that changing into the transforming into the kind of person that you want and need to be, that's the tough one.
Yeah. And speaking of that, right, there are some folk on the East Coast here, and particularly in New York City, that's working on legislation that's called post-traumatic prison disorder, right? Really looking at and examining how the incarcerated experience impacts one while incarcerated, traumatizes them, and upon their release, they carry that trauma with them, hence the term post-traumatic, right? And so similar to someone being in the military and being deployed into a country and being involved in the theater of war and being released, they also have these kind of like symptoms, right, of trauma from that post kind of experience. So just wanted to note that as something that's being worked on in New York City. And, but as you all talk about this, right, Lauren, you've been writing about this work. Sterling, you have lived it and are also writing it throughout the work you're doing. What can we do, like in the trenches, right, in our communities, in our neighborhoods, right, to help those who are recently released to find a place, right, and begin like reclaiming their lives? And either one of you can start first.
Do you want to jump in there, Sterling, or shall I?
Yeah, I mean, we can do a lot, and a lot is being done, and I also want to preface, or kind of before going forward, I want to be clear that, just like everybody that has been to the military or any major life transitions, there are those that become effective and have clear ideas and develop loving relationships, like in there's still challenges, right? There's still challenges, even if somebody does as good as they can do, got job, got family support, got everything else, but still face felony exclusions that are barrier, that those frustrations also create some of that tension. And so one of the things that we can do and is important to do is start working with people where they're at. I mean, start connecting with people inside of these institutions and having these conversations about goals or needs and how to build this relationships and moving forward. And be there when they come out and help them move towards meaningful lives. Some of us, let's change the conversation from trying to define how do we help people just survive and having that be a success, to focusing on how do we help people thrive in their reentry. And those conversations can occur with employers, they can occur with legislatures, they can occur with your neighbors, they can occur everywhere. And the
landlords,
yeah,
landlords,
especially landlords. Like landlord, bank managers, bank owners. Like I'm right now, I'm currently barred by regulation to where I can't get a loan because of 2 years of employment, a non-verifiable 2 years of employment, and they won't count the work that I did throughout 27 years of incarceration because I was forced to work. Right. And so it was so there's still real barriers. So it's like, that is going to create a psychological stress on anybody. Right. I don't care what they're back. Let them go through a divorce, let them go through a death, let them go through any life change, and then face numerous barriers in their recovery, and it's going to create stresses and tensions, right? Yep. And so anywhere that we can intervene in helping build the individual and support those healing processes that have to occur, and B, dismantle some of these barriers. That's how you get in the trenches, get connected to the people where they are, and try to figure out how to get them to where they want to be.
Absolutely. Lauren?
One thing I want to say that is just slightly outside of this conversation but needs to be said is when we talk about the toxic environment of prison and the difficulty of reentry, I also want to say that for some people, and Sterling is certainly a sterling example of this, prison also teaches resilience and perseverance. So people who get out after a long time, they actually have some strengths going for them. They have a lot of institutional barriers. They have perhaps this post-incarcerated syndrome that you're talking about, but they also have a kind of determination and a sense of that they're just a sense of resilience. And I think that's incredibly important and needs to be recognized. So getting to your point, though, I think that people in communities and in neighborhoods can actively mentor those folks who are coming out. And by mentor, I don't mean be some kind of a teacher or a therapist or anything. I just kind of mean hang out. So in the town that I live in, the city I live in, there's a wraparound services reentry program, and part of that is becoming a mentor, which I have done for a couple of women. And it's just, going, getting a cup of coffee, talking about stuff, taking a walk, and just being a person in the community who is just there saying, yeah, you're here and I'm here, and let's just hang out. And I think that's really important. The other point is, as Sterling said, and as every criminologist has said for the last 2 decades, you start inside. You start all of this inside. Because the day that you get in is the day that you start thinking about getting out, and the program to be there.
Some people are of the opinion that reentry starts the very moment you are incarcerated. Right. As soon as you're incarcerated, your reentry process should begin in terms of learning, developing yourself, preparing yourself for release. And so the other thing I want to kind of note, speaking of release um, and reentry, there's data out there that says, after 3 years of release, at least 60% of people who are being released returning back to prison, right? Which is a term of like recidivism. So this notion of the myth of the math, like talk to our viewers about what does that mean? Because again, like in New York, particularly New York State, again, I think there may be some national implications around this. Again, like close to 60% of the people are returned back to the prison after 3 years or so. So talk about that.
I actually just wrote very recently a blog about the myth of the math of recidivism. And the data from New York is there's very good data from New York. I mean, it's good data, but it's bad news.
Right.
And it is so there are many reasons why people go back inside. One of the obvious one, which everybody immediately defaults to, is they committed another crime, right? And that is not always or sometimes often what happens. It is often a parole violation.
Correct.
Right. And sometimes it's not even a very dangerous parole violation, being in the wrong place at the wrong time, getting yeah. And that kind of stuff comes from how we create the parole system and the extraordinary caseload that POs have so that they actually can't get to know who their clients are. Because if they knew, then they'd know, oh yeah, okay, they did that because they were, because of some reason that's legitimate. I'm not going to tag them. They're not going to go back. But the parole violations are, if you cut that out and just look at people who are committing new crimes, the recidivism would the level would go way down. The numbers would go way down.
Sure. And your thoughts on that, Sterling? This whole
You know,
myth of the math.
yeah, I ain't never been good at math. I'm a poet, that's so. But and as a poet, I pay more closely attention to human behavior, and my personal experience was in transformation, and it was a lot of internal processes. But I also know that it's somewhat of a red herring in a way to talk about the recidivism rate. Even if when you remove violations, you can be violated for a whole that varies county to county, state to state, and they can pretty much do what they want to do. So you're gonna find a lot of violations just due to personality conflicts and everything else. Uh, so, and then those that do recommit crimes, when we focus in on them, one of the things that we're missing is how prepared, like what resources, what is the barriers, how does this happen. Most people in my experience, when they first go to prison, they want to change. Nobody lands in Very few people may land in prison and feel like they've had any type of success in their life. And when you hit bottom, you start trying to figure out how to put the pieces to your life together, and one of the very first things you got to figure out is where you went wrong. So people start looking for ways to make changes and move forward, and not only be safe citizens, but productive, to become resources. We become credible messengers, and we want to do redemptive work. But way before a person even gets there, they spend years and years and years in an environment where there isn't the resources or the focus for that type of goal building or pro-social activity. So what resources is put available to even prepare for success? And then when you come out and you face all of these other challenges, both psychologically and structurally, and everything costs money. But if you're not working and you ain't got no place to live, and you're dealing with all of these tensions and all of these pressures, and the only seemingly available opportunities economically are in alternative economies, people return to crime largely sometimes for economic incentives. And you become a criminal or you become homeless.
Absolutely. And when you think about that, Sterling and Laura, right, when these barriers are eliminated and people are able to be released back to the community prepared, that is a definition, I think, at least loosely, of what to be free means, right? Because to be free is not only right to work on healing oneself while you're incarcerated, right? To address the trauma, to atone and reconcile from the harm you've caused, but also when you're released, you have access to the things you need to support your transformation and transition. I think that's one definition of being free. And speaking of free, right, your book, right, Laura, is entitled Free, right? So, what's the one thing you hope every reader gets from this book, Free?
The one thing.
I mean, at least one thing, right, that you would hope people get from it.
That's a really hard one to answer. And I will answer it, but I do want to say of the 6 people that I followed, and I didn't, 4 of those 6 people in their free world life are activists working for prison reform,
Right.
working with social justice issues. And I think that's really important to note. I didn't choose these people because of that. That
Right.
is the kind of people they became. So there's that. I think that the big message for me in being involved in this book, since I had not spent time inside myself, I spent inside teaching writing, but not as an incarcerated individual,
Right.
is that people are capable of extraordinary change, and that we, those of us who are out in the free world, need to open our minds and our hearts to the idea that someone who did harm is not all about the harm, that we don't judge people by the very worst thing they ever did, because because people change and they own their flaws and they work on their flaws. And sometimes people, in my experience, people who have been incarcerated work harder on themselves than those of us who have not faced that kind of momentous thing in our lives. So people can change, and we need to give them the opportunity to do that and celebrate that change.
Absolutely. And Sterling, you're obviously an example of transformation, and you went into prison at a very early age and grew all obviously to become a man, right, while incarcerated. And you found redemptive space, right, through writing and empowering others while you were inside. And so, Sterling, like, talk to us. I know that you and obviously Lauren have met each other, etc. How did you all become close friends?
Oh man. So, I say everywhere I go, the 2 most transformative forces in my life was love and education. Loving relationships helped me heal internally and then feel connected to others outwardly. And education expanded the realm of my thinking. And not only have I bonded with Lauren like a brother and a sister, we're both Aries and so much alike. But I've also learned so much in how to shape my voice and the power of personal stories, because that's the oldest, most effective way to dissolve stigma, is to hear somebody's story. Because what we're talking about is human beings inside of particularly challenging context, but the human heart, the human brain is the same. And when you can tell that story to help highlight that humanity, that's incredible. And that was one of the gifts that she had taught me, and throughout learning and sharing and growing together, it's healing. And so that's how we became cool. We just grew together.
Lauren?
So I started a writers group at the maximum security penitentiary where Sterling was incarcerated. And I, for the reasons that Sterling, I think that stories change lives. They are ways of you understanding who you are by telling your story. And they are ways of changing other people's lives when you tell your story. So the people behind bars are invisible and often voiceless. And I wanted to help make them less visible and help enhance their voices. So that is how we met. And I would say that for anything that I taught, and I hope that we had good moments of teaching, I learned so much more than I ever taught as a writer or as a storyteller. But that's how Sterling and I met. He was one of 10 men in my writers group that continued almost right up to the time of COVID, when everything stopped, when there were no more visitors inside the prison.
So the Aryan writers. Right?
That's right.
Writers.
Aryan warrior writers.
Aries, not Aryan.
No.
Sorry.
Yeah.
I said that wrong
Well,
too.
Aryan is Aries, right?
Yes.
Aries,
Absolutely
April.
no
April.
relationship.
Yes, the April-born folk. Let me just say
Yes.
that, right?
Much better.
So we're
Thank
not
you.
talking about the Aryan
Yeah.
nation, right? We're talking about Aries folk, born in
Aries.
April.
Aries
But
warrior.
yeah, Lauren Sterling, thank you so much for this interview and just for this work itself. And we'll certainly look to have you back on at some point on both sides of the bars to give us an update on what's happening in your life. Certainly look forward to connecting with you guys on the advocacy side here on the East Coast. And we just thank you. And, we thank all of you, the viewers, right, for viewing here at both sides of the bars. We thank you for joining us for this thought-provoking conversation, as it's very important. But in the meantime, on behalf of the Fortune Society, we thank you for tuning in here. If you're interested in finding out more about the Fortune Society, please check us out on the web, www.fortunesociety.org. You can also find us on Facebook by typing in Fortune Society. This is Andre Ward, and as always, we thank you for joining us here today on both sides of the bars. You out.